What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of today's episode. And today I am talking again about therapist burnout. I know if you've been following me for a while, you know that this is a topic I've definitely spoken about before, whether I've made entire episodes dedicated to the topic or just, spoken about it within episodes that I make. And the reason why I talk about it so much is because it's very much still a problem in a major way amongst therapists. So we'll keep talking about it as long as it's still an issue. May there be a day in the future where I don't need to talk about it so much because it's just a non-issue. I'm just speaking that out into the universe just in case that does anything. Therapist burnout is kind of always on my mind because it's such a big problem. But the thing that bumped it onto my radar again this time was the latest issue of the Monitor on Psychology. This is the April-May 2024 issue, and they talk about it a little bit. The headliner topic from this issue was more about artificial intelligence, and it's not even one of the sort of featured articles up here in the front, so I almost missed it. But it is in here. So let me take you along for the ride. I've linked to this article below as well. If you want to follow along, you can access it online for free. Now, the Monitor on Psychology is published by the APA, the American Psychological Association, which oversees the licenses of psychologists. So their research is looking specifically at psychologists and not all therapists or even all therapists in the US. That said, I have a feeling this information likely is going to look similar across all the different types of licensure one can find. Now, all of that caveating said, the title of this article is, "At What Stage in Their Careers Are Psychologists Most at Risk of Burnout?" What an intriguing title. I was curious about it. Is it that by the time you've been in the career for a really long time, you're just so sick and tired of it that you're more likely to burn out at the end? While, the bright-eyed, young, spry, bushy-tailed, newer therapists in the field just have an abundance of energy? Or is it that, with experience, you have more resources to kind of deal with the things that can contribute to burnout, and so it's less common as you're further in your career, and maybe for newer folks it's more common. So I opened the article to this page thinking about these things, and I have some reactions that I'd like to share. So this article is supposed to emphasize which phase of our career psychologists are most prone to burn out. But of course, the first thing that I looked at when I read the article was the graph showing the data. And the thing that stood out to me the most was actually that burnout seems pretty high across the board for everybody. So spoiler alert, even though the article is focusing on which phase of our career psychologists are most prone to burnout, the real takeaway is that all psychologists are real prone to burnout. Like, these numbers are alarming. Let me actually focus on what the article is saying. So here's a quote from the article. Quote, "Early career psychologists were consistently more likely to report they felt burned out than psychologists in later career stages. Although rates of burnout are slowly falling, each year of the survey, more than 1/3 of the psychologists still reported feeling burned out." And they also say, quote, "Early and mid-career psychologists consistently reported higher levels of stress than senior and late senior careers psychologists, according to the annual APA practitioner surveys conducted in 2021 through 2023. In fact, psychologists' average self-reported stress levels decreased as psychologists' careers advanced." So at this point, I'm obviously intrigued. I want to learn more. I go to turn the page to read the rest of the article, and that's the end of the article. I literally read you 2/3 of the entire article because it is only 3 paragraphs long with the graphics to go along with it. So I was left hanging. A Monitor on Psychology. Where's the rest of my burnout article? To be fair, this section of the magazine is called Data Point. I think it's supposed to just be like a little tidbit of research for your edification, I guess. But yeah, I felt like I was really left hanging. So APA, if you could keep talking about this data and elaborate some more, that would be awesome. Because according to the data that you're reporting on, psychologists are burning out, not just early in our career, but across our entire career a lot. So let's look at some of the numbers that they do put in this graph. And I'll read the footnote that describes the phases of career as they define them. Early career is defined as psychologists with 10 or fewer years of professional experience since earning their doctorate. Mid-career is defined as psychologists with 11 to 20 years of professional experience since earning their doctorate. Late career is defined as psychologists with 21 to 30 years of professional experience since earning their doctorate. And late senior career is defined as psychologists with 31 or more years of professional experience since earning their doctorate. First of all, late senior career psychologist, 31 years. Kudos to you. I mean, I guess, am I still going to be... Oh yeah, actually, okay. I was 25 when I got my doctorate. So 30 years in, I will be 55 and I would like to still be working. I mean, this really stands out to me because even as someone who has barely had their doctorate degree for 12 years at this point, it will be 12 years later this year, I feel like my experience in the first 2-3 years right after earning my doctorate was way more stressful than it was 5 years out, 7 years out. Like the difference between my stress levels now compared to say 5 years after I got my doctorate are really probably comparable, but the difference between 1 year after having my doctorate and 4 years after having my doctorate is a big difference in my stress levels. Like personally for me, I'd be very curious to see that broken down even more. Like, can early career be broken down into its subdivisions of the first couple years out versus 5 years out versus 9 years out? Also, I'd be really curious to hear more about how those stress levels compare to, let's say, while you're still in graduate school. All of that would be very interesting, especially since they're saying it's in this early career phase that stress levels are higher. All of that prefacing in place, here's the data where they looked at psychologists' average self-reported stress levels by career stage and year from 2021 through 2023. And psychologists reported their stress level on a scale of 1 to 10, and the overall reported stress levels across all stages of career for 2021 were 6 on average for all psychologists who reported back. 2022, it was 4.9 overall, and in 2023, it was 5.9 overall. So that's kind of an interesting, I wonder why it was slightly less stressful in 2022 versus coming back again in 2023, basically to where it was before. But then if you look at the breakdown, early career versus later career, I mean, the early career folks, their average reported stress level in 2021 was 6.5, and then the same number again in 2023. And the late senior career folks reported that their average stress level in 2021 was 5.4, and in 2023 it was 5.3. So we're looking at a statistically significant difference in what people are reporting, but these are people who are giving a 5 or a 6 on average when you're in your first few years versus maybe your final years as a psychologist. And also mid-career reports were matching the early career reports of stress levels. So that's also real interesting. You have to apparently be working for at least 20 years for the stress levels to start declining. Now, there was a much greater discrepancy across the career span for psychologists who responded that they either agree or strongly agree with the statement, quote, "I feel burned out." Those numbers have stayed loosely stable over the 3 years that they took a look at in these surveys, but the highest level of agree or strongly agree with, quote, "I feel burned out," happened for the therapists in their early career. That's their first 10 years since having their doctorate, with 64.5% agreeing with those statements in 2021, and that number in 2023 was 57.3%. Compared to those in their late senior career, they've been in their career as a psychologist for at least 30 years, where in 2021, only 29.6% either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. And in 2023, 22.2% said, "I agree or I strongly agree with the statement, quote, "I feel burned out." So that is obviously a massive discrepancy. I mean, that's more than double of psychologists in their first 10 years of their career saying they feel burned out compared to psychologists who've been doing this for 30 years or more. All that said, that's all this article gives us. Here's some info. Pretty much everyone is stressed out on average, and a lot of people are burned out in their career, and it's much worse early in your career. And then bye-bye, end of article. So of course, naturally, this took me on a rabbit trail because I wanted to know the answer of what data do we have about therapists burning out in the profession. So I'm going to take you on that journey with me now. Let's see what else is out there. And to define burnout, just so we make sure we're on the same page, according to the APA dictionary, burnout is defined as, quote, physical, emotional, or mental exhaustion accompanied by decreased motivation, lowered performance, and negative attitudes towards oneself and others. It goes on to say, it results from performing at a high level until stress and tension, especially from extreme and prolonged physical or mental exertion or an overburdening workload, take their toll. Absolutely terrifying. Let's avoid that if we can, right? It is worth noting too that this data collection is happening in the during COVID and then post-COVID time, but we're still very much dealing with the mental health aftermath of everything that happened during COVID. So could it be possible that over the years we're going to see these numbers subside? Time will tell, but it does stand out to me that the numbers held pretty steady in 2023 compared to 2021. So I'll be really curious to see if that keeps holding steady or if it changes going forward. But it does seem pretty consistent across all reports that during COVID and immediately post-COVID, like the demand for therapy increased quite a bit. Therapists' workload just really got burdened, and also the intensity of types of presenting issues therapists were working with also worsened during COVID. Here's a quote from an article by the APA titled, "Practitioners are overworked and burned out and they need our support." This is back from April 2023, a year ago before the time that I'm recording this video. It says, quote, "In response to a survey in September 2022, 38% of U.S. licensed psychologists reported that they were working more than they did before the pandemic." And it continues on saying, faced with the increased workload, the percentage of psychologists who reported not being able to meet the demand rose from 30% in 2020 and 41% in 2021 to 46% in 2022. Almost half, 45%, reported feeling burned out in 2022, with similar levels reported in 2020 and 2021. So yeah, we know the pandemic definitely correlated with a shift in the demand for therapists and also therapist burnout. But pandemic or not, I just wanted to get whatever information was available about therapists and burnout. Also, the information I've shared so far is specific to psychologists from the APA, so I want to learn about burnout amongst all therapists. I found this meta-analysis article published in Frontiers in Psychology in August 2022 that had quite a bit of information. So let's dig into it. The title of this article is Burnout and Psychological Wellbeing Among Psychotherapists, a Systematic Review. I will link to this article and all the other ones I've mentioned below so you can do your own reading if you're interested, but I'll summarize some of the things that I thought were most interesting. So this article is a systematic review of 52 other articles taking a look at therapist burnout as well as psychological well-being of therapists. And this systematic review reconfirmed the claim from the Monitor in Psychology article that kicked off this whole video, saying, quote, "Younger psychotherapists tend to report increased levels of burnout symptoms in comparison to older and more experienced colleagues in that profession." And I'm not really sure how they do this practically when they're conducting the research, but they go on to offer an explanation for why this is. They say, quote, "In our specific context, this is explained by the fact that young psychotherapists often have excessively high and unrealistic expectations about their role in this job, and the subsequent reality crash may be a significant burnout catalyst for them." When I saw this part of the article, I really appreciated it. I actually hadn't heard anybody present this perspective before, but it makes sense to me when I hear it. Like, yeah, that fit for me. I'm going to make a statement that I'm aware at face value is not going to sound great, but just bear with me because I think it's probably true for a lot of us, I think. But my expectations of myself as a therapist in graduate school and in my early career were much higher than they are now. So I get that that sounds borderline unethical. Like I just expect less and less of myself over time. But now looking back at it, the way that I see it is that my expectations of myself early on were just impossibly high. And is that just coming from my own internal anxious tendencies? Did I have messaging that reinforced that or some mixture of all of the above? I'm not totally sure, but it was there. It was true for me. I thought that as a new therapist trainee, seeing my very first clients, that I needed to know every single relevant therapeutic skill and intervention. I needed to be familiar with every single potential diagnosis that might walk through and sit on the couch with me. Like, And now I don't even expect that of myself. I expect that I stay highly skilled and knowledgeable in the areas that I focus on, because there is just so much that none of us can be an expert in every single thing that one could be an expert in as a therapist. And of course, I need to stay abreast of all general knowledge so that I'm not sideswiped by things popping up in session that I didn't foresee. But I don't need to know every single detail about every single diagnosis, every single therapeutic intervention, every single everything. So my expectations, I think now, are much more appropriate. And knowing I can consult, I can go get training, I can always go access information if I realize that I need to edify what I know now, rather than having to know it all up front. Okay, for y'all listening to the podcast, you got to hear that whole tangent. And the reason why I gave so much airtime to that little story of mine is because I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. And now to see this research study suggesting or concluding in their results that this unrealistic expectation that we have of ourselves early on may be one of the very contributors to what they refer to as a reality crash, leading to burnout. Like, we should talk about this. Like, if it really is true that folks earlier in their career are more prone to burnout, and that is a direct result of us having way too high expectations of ourselves as therapists, can we do something about that? That feels like something that we can do something about when there are so many things that feel like they're outside of our control. Like, can graduate programs, can practicum placements, supervisors, employers, just anyone interacting with others early in their career, or just us amongst ourselves, regardless of where we are in our career, like, can we interact with each other in a way that brings all of us back to planet Earth as far as what's realistic to expect of ourselves given where we're at in our career today? Not in a way to minimize how much knowledge someone early in their career might have, because we've also talked about how therapists tend to be more effective earlier in their career than they are later in their career. I know when I did a video on that, a lot of folks really had a strong reaction to that, but I was just presenting the data. So it's there. So even though we tend to be more effective earlier in our careers than we are later in our careers, we also have much higher expectations of ourselves earlier in our career to an extent that is just unreasonable. So we can trust that we have enough knowledge for today to do our work that we need to do and be effective enough, and trust that we're still learning and we can keep growing and accessing more information. And there will never be a day when we know all the things. We can't know all the things, because we're humans. Some other important things that they uncovered in this systematic review are, quote, traits related to negative emotionality, such as neuroticism and emotional reactivity, were burnout predictors, while those associated with emotional stability and high levels of subjectively perceived resources, such as resilience, were buffers against this syndrome in this occupation. And the quote goes on to say, similarly, emotion-oriented coping was positively correlated with burnout. I know that's tricky. Positively correlated means there's increased burnout, while problem-focused coping or the use of humor to deal with work-related stress were negatively linked to burnout symptoms in this occupation. Now, there are parts of that quote that kind of common sense-wise makes sense to me. Like, if you believe you have more coping resources, you are less prone to burnout, for example. And even things that make sense, like, oh, if you're able to lean into problem solving or using humor to make light of the situation and process it, you're also less prone to burnout. But I'm really curious, they talk about emotion-oriented coping as correlated with burnout, and I'm really curious what emotion-oriented coping is. Let me Google it. Okay, here's a little quote from the National Institutes of Health. It says, quote, emotion-oriented coping is defined as individuals' efforts at reducing stress through emotional responses, including emotion expression, blaming others, self-blame, emotion containment, and passive resignation. Oh, yes. Okay, that clarifies it for me. I wonder if that's kind of similar to the research that we learn about where, if you're overly leaning into your emotions when you're venting, it could actually just make the anger or whatever emotions are coming up bigger. It doesn't help it calm down per se. So I could see that. It's like if you already feel like you're burning out and now you're venting about it and you're complaining about it, there's cynicism, you're overly emotional about it, and you're not problem solving. then the burnout sensation just grows. So it sounds like there's a takeaway we might be able to extrapolate here, or at least seems like it couldn't do more harm. And that's if you're finding any signs of burnout popping up for you, or like the warning signs that you might be headed that way, rather than minimizing it or overinflating it with overly emotional responses, it might be really helpful to name reality for what it is, see if there's anything you can do to help problem solve, and access as many resources as you have on the topic. And apparently, if there's any way to access humor around it and make light of it without minimizing it, that may help you as well. Who knew? And here are a couple of other takeaways that came from this systematic review that we've been looking at. Quote, 6 studies have revealed significant associations between high workload and increased levels of burnout. I think we have Captain Obvious to thank for that one, but it is still helpful to see that it is supported in the data. And I know that people are going to leave some comments about this next one, even though I'm just reading a quote, because some people are going to see it as combative, and I'm sharing some data. So here's one more finding they found. Quote, additionally, working in the public sector seemed to be positively associated with burnout levels. Again, positively associated means there's increased levels of burnout associated with being in the public sector. It continues on about this saying, quote, this finding was usually explained by a lack of control over their own work environment among psychotherapists and an increased level of bureaucracy in such workplaces compared to private psychotherapists' offices, where they may feel that they have more control over when, where, and how they will be working with their clients. And thank goodness, a moment of hope. Quote, lastly, personal therapy and or supervision act as a buffer against burnout, as mentioned by 5 authors. Also, an interesting perspective about this systematic review that the authors advocate for is that it's important to not just look at levels of burnout, but also levels of overall well-being amongst therapists, and how that's a relatively untapped phenomenon, that people are not researching well-being. And so they clearly seem to think, at least, that therapists who have greater well-being overall might also reap those benefits in their satisfaction at work. And, maybe that would be associated with lower levels of burnout. So they kind of conclude by saying like, hey, we should probably research this a little bit more, which I agree, that would be really interesting to learn about. Well, I know this video is just me sharing some of the information that's available out there and offering some of my own kind of opinions and perspectives interlaced. Like, I know that I personally don't have the direct solution for like, here's how to solve all burnout. I wish I could do something like that, but I can talk about it. And it does feel, even the fact that like we have this significant data in this magazine showing that no matter where you are in your career as a psychologist, at least, like burnout rates and stress levels are quite high. Like even for those in what they call late senior career, like 22% of folks in that stage of their career reported that they agree or strongly agree with the statement, quote, I feel burned out in 2023. So that's still like 1 in 5, right? More than that. And it goes up from there. So that's like a lot of people saying that they feel burned out. And of course, if you're early in your career, more than half of folks early in their career are saying that they're burned out. So even though I can't fix it all, I can talk about it. And so I hope it's helpful to, at the very least, if you're feeling stressed or burned out in your workplace, that you feel seen and validated. What you're going through, unfortunately, is normal. The way that we've set up our career is setting folks up for burnout and stress. So hopefully over time we can change our cultural practices and the structures around our career in general. But I do think this is a good opportunity for each of us to check in and see what are our expectations of ourselves within this career, particularly for folks who are earlier on in their career process, and see if there's appropriate spaces for you to kind of reality check your expectations of yourself. Whether it's a supervisor, a consult group, your personal therapist, or just your classmates if you're in grad school, just kind of check in to say, here's kind of generally what I expect of myself as a therapist at this point in my career. What do you think of that? Is that appropriate? Is there anything that I should adjust in my expectations of myself? And not to degrade all the skills that you bring forth, because you do already have so many, but to bring yourself back to a healthy, appropriate reality and say, I'm right where I'm supposed to be right now. If I need help with something, I can ask for help. There's information available for me to gather if and when I need it. And if I'm not totally sure what to do in the moment, or, I'm struggling with something that's going on in my career, that's okay. That's appropriate. That doesn't mean I'm falling short somehow. So that feels like a very helpful narrative shift that we all can work on together to collectively do a reality check as a profession. And I also appreciated the takeaway of making sure we're not having overly emotionally oriented responses when we're seeing signs of burnout, whether we're seeing it in ourselves and looking at how we respond, but also for those of us who are in the support networks of someone that we might be witnessing burning out, that it may go above and beyond simply lending a listening ear, especially if we're seeing somebody go the kind of cynical, emotionally reactive route, when maybe there's some problem solving that could help the situation. And honestly, any kind of conversation on this topic, I think, has the potential to be so helpful. Simply having conversations acknowledging burnout is so pervasive in our career across all phases of the career, and especially so early on in our career. So let's talk about it. Let's try to get ahead of it rather than wait for it to show up on our door and be surprised that it's there, when we have the data to support that more than half of early career therapists are saying they're burned out. So let's talk about it. Let's make sure we have all the things in place that we can to help minimize burnout and make sure folks have access to resources if and when they need them, or before they need, let them know, it's like how you want to know where the fire extinguisher is before the fire happens. It's not like there's a fire, let's go now and look for a fire extinguisher. We don't know where it is. It's like we have a safety protocol because sometimes fires happen. We hope it doesn't, but it does sometimes. So we have a fire extinguisher. Here's the fire alarm. Here's a fire drill. This is what we do when it happens. And I think we should treat burnout the same way of what's the drill? Here's our resources. Please use them if you find yourself in a situation where you might be approaching burnout. You know what I mean? That's all Marie's opinion, and not a important researcher person told me that that's what we should do, but it just kind of feels like common sense, and I know I would appreciate it in a workplace, so it's a good place to start, I think. Well, thank you for hanging with me. And if you have any advice that you found really helpful when you were maybe inching towards burnout or potentially already burned out, feel free to leave it in the comments below, as other people might be going through that right now, and they might find that really helpful to see what you found helpful. And I'll say I can speak from experience as someone who has definitely burned out in the workplace real hard before. And that is whatever kind of quote unquote symptoms are happening for you in the burnout, there is a point where burnout becomes so big that you lose control of your own capacity to cope. So if you have gotten to that point, just know that it happens. There comes a point in burnout where if you're that burned out, you can no longer simply push through and just do the work, even though you maybe quote unquote don't feel like it. If we let it go long enough, eventually the burnout will hit a threshold where you cannot push through anymore. Or if somehow you find a way to keep pushing through, you are only feeding the burnout at that point. And I am speaking for me from my own direct experience. And we know from the research that once someone is at that point, there has to be a drastic change to help somebody get out of that burnout, whether it's taking a sabbatical, changing jobs, pivoting to a different set of responsibilities in the role that you have, but just carrying on and pushing through with everything else staying the same. We just know that just doesn't work. Well, I know this is a heavier topic, but I hope that by speaking about it, I'm offering something helpful into the profession, into the universe. I hope you found this supportive wherever you might be in your career journey, burnt out or not. I will keep talking about burnout as long as it continues to be a issue amongst us, and hopefully we can move the needle in a healthier direction. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.